I'm delighted to be with you today. Today is World Rivers Day. I don't know whether you are aware. That's globally. And why am I starting with this? It's because rivers have been in the media a lot, particularly in the UK. I don't know how many of you know how much fresh water do we have on Earth. Anyone has any idea? Any idea? Okay. So I can tell you that fresh water of the sort we think of when talking about fresh water is only 3%, 2.5% of the water in the world is just fresh water, that small amount. And it's really the majority of it locked up on ice, up in the glaciers. And we're talking about then a small amount that can be found somewhere else, underground, for example. And from that, 0.3 is what we found in lakes and rivers. So I start with this so that you understand how rare it is to find fresh water on Earth. And so I want to even go further, because here in the UK, we are very lucky. There may be about 200 or 215 chalk streams in the world. This is a particular type of fresh water, which is very rich on minerals and very rare. Now, from that, 85% is found in the UK. I mean, that's just amazing. And I want to just to have a round of applause to that, you know, to actually greet that fact. This is how wonderful and rich the biodiversity in this country is. And now, chalk streams are well known because they are very rich on minerals, and the water is cold and clear. It's extremely biodiverse as a habitat. And that's basically the reason why it's so special. At present, I'm working with the council in Hampshire to enhance the protection of rivers, but in particular, to have an initiative that will focus on chalk streams. So today, I'm speaking about nature itself and whether nature can have rights. Now, I want to know from this room, how many of you think that that makes sense? Does nature have rights? How many of you agree with that idea? Okay. So there's a very positive, I think, representation of those who think that it should. Well, yes, let me tell you how I started questioning that. I used to work a lot on cases that were raising environmental matters, but usually they were all about harms that were affecting human beings. Until one day, I was instructed to act for a forest, and there were no human beings there. And for the first time in my life, I had to directly advocate for fungi and for bears and for monkeys and orchids and all sort of creatures in this cloud forest. I want to retrace a little bit back to what I was saying. And this is about nature itself. And I will tell you more about this case because that was really something that shifted everything in my practice. Going to the very concept of nature. And first of all, taking a step back and talking about humanness. So, as humanity, we went through really huge challenges during the last century, because there were no standards before, until we got to this point where crimes against humanity, genocide was committed. And there was a point where all of this shocked the consciousness of humanity so much that we developed standards post-1945. This is the basis for our notion, modern notions of human rights. And all these treaties that we had, starting first with the Declaration, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, we had a new paradigm. And that paradigm, for example, declared that we have the right to life, human beings, and declared many other rights, inherent rights. So we were not granted rights, but it was rather a moment where we acknowledged that by the mere fact of being human beings, of being alive, we possessed those rights, the right to dignity, the right of freedom of thought, the right to life, and many other basic rights. Now, I think that was a very positive development, but at the same time, something happened, unfortunately, which is the separation of what we consider human, a separation from nature and from the environment, because in this special list of rights, the way we understood it traditionally, there's no mention to the environment or to nature, or even to the fact that we are also part of nature. And so we have had a number of years developing jurisprudence and everything where, judges have been called on to interpret what is to be human, and it's always been in separation to the environment and to human and to nature. Environmental law as such developed far, far later. In fact, from the 70s onwards. And it really developed on the basis of soft law, not even treaties like binding instruments, but rather some pronouncements and declarations that were considered just as guidance and didn't have really teeth. So we had in 1972 the first milestone, and later we had in 1992 the Rio Declaration. Both are important instruments, but both are anthropocentric. If there is a reference to nature, it's as a resource. And that has been our paradigm. That's been our model. But something happened before the Rio Declaration. And that was in 1982, where we had a General Assembly resolution that approved, that adopted the World Charter for Nature, and was the only first instrument in which the relationship with nature, the humankind, human beings with nature, it was stated in a different way, including accepting that we are part of nature. And I think that we have to go back to that moment, which was lost. Now, what has happened since? Well, the crisis that we are aware has happened since. And the crisis that we are living is not only a climate crisis or biodiversity crisis. There is a common thread there, any of the crises that we are talking about. And that is the fundamental issue that is wrong is the relationship with nature. Because we wouldn't be where we are with the climate crisis if the relationship had been a different one. Not one of exploitation without limits, but one that acknowledges the right role that nature has in sustaining life in this planet, including our life. But not only our life. And so we are right now at the moment where courts are having to deal with environmental issues more and more, including within the spectrum of human rights. More and more. I am part of that, I think, wave of movement or initiatives taking, construing rights in this way. And judges more and more accepting that's the case. And that's why we had recently the climate cases in the European Court of Human Rights. And generally, there is a process right now, I would say, in international law, from law of the sea to what the International Court of Justice just did this year. There is a greening process because, yes, nature didn't have a proper place in our laws, and now it's being, in a way, reconsidered. So I dare to say that right now we are living a moment that is very similar to what our elders probably lived during the Enlightenment, when all these notions about human beings and human rights developed. But this time is in connection to nature and our place in the world, seen not from an anthropocentric perspective, but from a ecocentric perspective. So what I learned in the case of Los Cedros, which is the case that I was called on to represent, is how fragile our natural world is, but at the same time, how amazing. So this was a cloud forest that was threatened with a gold mine operation, which was really led by a Canadian company, Cornerstone. And they wanted to exploit gold, but the place was very close to the Ecuador line. And that means that the place is extremely rich. In one patch of Earth, you could find a species that you couldn't find on the other side. And in fact, those species couldn't be found anywhere else in the world. There was a frog, for example, which is a wonder and an indicator of purity of water. That apparently is the only frog in the world that can change its entire color. And I think it's camouflage. But these indicators of, for example, purity of water only exist in a certain patch, even in that forest. And that was all going. Or, for example, the Andean bear that actually lives in the forest. Or fungi, or orchids, or jaguars. There were so many different species that were unique to this forest. And as I was studying all this material that just came, I understood that what was at stake was not just something disposable. What was at stake was something sacred almost. Now, some biologists have said that, and this is a very famous American biologist, E.O. Wilson. I don't know whether you are familiar with him, but he said something that really made me think. He said, in the name of development, this is my own addition, we are right now burning paintings, Rembrandt-like paintings, to cook a dinner. And this is a kind of place, for example, that we would have been burning for what? In the name of what? In the name of progress is the question. Well, thanks God, that particular country has a constitution that actually acknowledges rights to nature. And that was the laws that allowed me to plead before the court for the right to exist of all these species. And we had this surreal hearing that I think is one of those hearings that will take place in the future more and more as countries understand what's going on. And after I finished with that hearing and I intervened and everything, next day I was wondering, have I dreamt about this or did it really happen? Because it was the first time ever that I had to advance an ecocentric approach purely on the basis of harm, not to human beings, but to other beings on Earth. And I believe that they had also the right to exist. We won, and that created really an amazing, yeah, winning is possible. And that created an amazing, I think, step other communities, many other courts now are drawing inspiration from that, because it was a 153 pages judgment where everything was analyzed in detail, and has inspired people well beyond. I got it out in the news because and I got it during the process. Also, I worked together with a company, of a PR company of young people, basically spreading that around in the UK, quite honestly, to put pressure on the process to make it more transparent. And we have today authors like Robert Marfanen that had gone to Los Cedros to go and see and experience what it is, what was saved. But here we are now advancing the same in the UK, first in the protection of rivers, and that's where I have turned my attention to, working with, for example, the protection of the River Ouse, that it was the first river ever in the UK to actually have acknowledged rights and inherent value. And that has been copied by other councillors around the UK in the face of the crisis we are seeing. And that's why I'm working with Hampshire. The Severn River also has a community wanting to defend it, and I am starting also work over there. But this is not just what I'm doing. A lot of people now have just taken up these causes, particularly communities interested in protecting the survival of rivers. So these are really a moment that needs to be grasped carefully. I believe that is our, perhaps, passport to the future, because what is at stake, what is threatened is huge. And my knowledge sometimes of what's going on, and I not only practice, obviously, domestically, but also internationally, I know what is going on at sea, with 70% of our world being sea. And we have had very important developments. I've taken part on that, and we are defending the earth, so to say, via these different ways of bringing all these issues to the attention of courts and courts delivering judgments. But I think the fundamental change has to happen here, in every single person's mind. Because so far, I mean, we were not educated to think that other creatures have the right to exist. We haven't been even able to get in touch with our own otherness. I don't know whether you remember Rimbaud's statement about the I, and I is other, which in French sounds very peculiar. That other is, we tend to think that we are just our ego. But in fact, you know, we commune with nature, and our brains evolved in the midst of nature, and we need that. We need to experience the wild to be happy. And sometimes we are not even aware to what extent. If we get depressed or we get low, you go out there in nature, and immediately you are going to feel different. Why is it that people need water? Why is it that people need to be nearby that is coming? And why is it that you need to see green? It's been scientifically proven. In Europe, there are laws now, they are starting developing that from a room you have to see at least 3 in your house, you have to see 3 trees. And you have to have within a certain 3 meters of your home, a place where you can exercise, etc., that is green. And there has to be a canopy in the place where you live, that it is actually considerable for you to also for the well-being of people. And it's known that those who live nearby trees, where there is good canopy, the life expectancy is longer. So this is not by chance. And so I think we are really getting to a point where people started to understand what it means to be human. And it is not in separation of nature. So I just want to stop with final, because I want to open the discussion. I want to have a conversation with you today. Obviously, I can speak about further about the cases I have worked and I have discussed in the book. But one of the things that I experienced as a lawyer when I represented people in solitary confinement in the past was to learn that people got mad if they couldn't have access to nature. And one of the first things they craved for was to see something growing. And in a cell that you didn't have access to any of that, you know, suddenly people face their own humanness and realize that, yeah, that's the extension of us, and that we really needed that badly. So that experience has taught me a lot of things. I am right now working with a community in Essex, in a little town, South End, where they are fighting for the life of one single tree that's been threatened with being cut down. And I was quite surprised that they put so much energy in protecting this tree, but it can be clearly seen that people feel kinship, and they are becoming more and more aware of how important it is to have our trees and to enjoy and to experience nature close from where you live. And I think that it is going to be a process by which we need to make judges and to have a new understanding, therefore, of these human rights I was just discussing before, where we integrate all these needs, but also, I guess, to give nature its right place. And I mentioned the word sacredness. I don't know how many of you have experienced sacredness when communing with nature in one way or another. Certainly indigenous peoples do. And there's a concept in Quechua traditions, and I come from Quechua background, although I don't speak Quechua, and you will see that in my book. I grew up in Lima, not in the Andes where my parents are from. But there is a concept called Aini, and that concept means reciprocity. I don't know how much of that you have practiced, Eva, but I invite you to reflect on reciprocity. If you have benefited in any way from nature, even if it's your garden, how much have you ever thought about honoring that? And in what way have you done that? So it's a very small practice, which usually it starts with just thinking. If it was water, you know, one thanks the water, or thanks if you have grown vegetables, etc. Have you thanked the earth for actually giving you that? And sometimes it's done in a very formal way, like putting a little bit of beer, you know, down. But it's the thinking. But it starts really triggering other ways of looking at nature, and then you start appreciating all what is alive. And I think that that's really the key to our future. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to open up the floor because I like to discuss with you, and I want to know what your ideas are and your questions.